What if I told you that the person you think you are, the one who worries about what others think, who defends your opinions like they are precious treasures, who lies awake rehearsing conversations and protecting your image, is not actually you at all but an elaborate illusion, a ghost that has convinced you it is real? I know this sounds impossible to believe because this illusion has been with you since childhood, growing stronger every year until you forgot entirely that there is something deeper, something truer beneath the costume. But I am here, an old Taoist monk who has spent decades watching clouds dissolve into emptiness and reform into new shapes, to share an ancient truth that can free you from a prison you did not know you were living in. You are not your thoughts, you are not your ego, you are not the voice in your head that never stops commenting on everything. This is not a mental trick or a clever philosophy to debate at dinner parties. This is the natural law that governs existence itself, the reality that the river knows but the ripples forget. Lao Tzu wrote in the Tao Te Ching that he who knows others is wise, but he who knows himself is enlightened, and what he meant is that most people spend their entire lives knowing only the false self, the ego, the acquired mind that is like a mask worn so long you forget you are wearing it. Right now, I invite you to take the first step toward remembering your true face by leaving a simple phrase in the comments below, a declaration that begins your awakening. I am not my thoughts. I am the awareness behind them. Write these words not for me or for others, but as a sacred reminder to yourself that you are ready to see through the greatest illusion human beings face, the illusion that the ego is who you really are. Let me share something I have observed in my many years walking among people in cities and villages and quiet mountain paths. Most human suffering comes not from the circumstances of life, but from the ego's reaction to those circumstances, from the elaborate stories the false self tells about what everything means. Someone speaks to you in a tone you perceive as disrespectful, and immediately the ego rises up like a disturbed hornet's nest, creating elaborate narratives about how you have been wronged, rehearsing the perfect comeback, replaying the moment over and over, building resentment like a wall between you and peace. But who is this that feels so insulted? Watch closely and you will see it is not your true nature that suffers, but the conditioned self, the collection of beliefs and identities you have accumulated like barnacles on a ship's hull. You identify with your nationality, your profession, your political views, your personality traits, and when any of these constructed identities feels threatened, the ego springs into defensive action, creating suffering where there need be none. A tree does not feel insulted when the wind bends its branches. Water does not take it personally when a stone blocks its path, but you, identified with your ego, feel wounded by every perceived slight, exhausted by every imagined judgment, trapped in an endless war to defend something that does not actually exist except in your own mind. The Taoists call this the acquired mind, the false self that developed through years of conditioning and socialization, and they distinguish it clearly from the original mind, your true nature that was there before you learned language, before you were told who you should be, before the ego constructed its elaborate palace of thought. This original mind is like the clear sky that is always there behind the clouds. The clouds of thought and ego pass through it, but they are not it, and when you remember this distinction, everything changes. In ancient China, the Taoist sages spent their lives observing not only the patterns of nature, but the patterns of human consciousness, and they discovered something remarkable that modern people have largely forgotten. Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu both taught that the source of human suffering is not the world itself, but the way the ego interprets and resists the world. The Tao, the way of nature, flows effortlessly through all things, creating and destroying, rising and falling, without any sense of self-importance or need for control. The river does not have an ego that worries whether it is flowing correctly or whether the other rivers think well of it. It simply flows, following the path of least resistance, and in this egoless flowing, it carves canyons and nourishes entire valleys. The mountain does not have an ego that compares itself to other mountains or feels inadequate, because it is not the tallest. It simply stands in its nature, and birds nest on its slopes and clouds crown its peak. Even the Tao itself, the source of all existence, operates with what we call Wu Wei, action without ego, accomplishment without claiming credit, creation without attachment to what is created. This is the teaching that can transform your life if you truly understand it. The ego is not your true self. It is simply a pattern of thought that has convinced you. It is real, like a dream character who forgets they are dreaming. The ancient masters called this original nature before ego develops the Tao mind, and they spent their lives cultivating practices to quiet the acquired ego mind, so the Tao mind could emerge naturally, like the moon reflecting on still water. When the surface of the lake is rippled with the constant movement of egoic thoughts, it cannot reflect the moon clearly. You see only broken fragments and distorted images. But when the ego mind settles into stillness, when you stop believing every thought that passes through your awareness, the surface becomes mirror-like, and the moon of your true nature appears in all its clarity. Zhuang Chu told a story about a man who was so identified with his shadow that he spent his entire life running from it, exhausting himself trying to escape what was never separate from him in the first place. This is the human condition under the spell of ego, running from aspects of yourself you have judged as wrong, defending aspects you have judged as right, never realizing that you are the awareness in which all these judgments appear and dissolve like morning mist. Come deeper into the forest of understanding with me now, where the teaching becomes more subtle and the path to freedom reveals itself in the observation of how thoughts actually work. Sit quietly for a moment and watch your mind. Notice how thoughts arise seemingly from nowhere, float through your awareness like clouds across sky and dissolve back into nothing. Did you create these thoughts? Are you controlling which thought comes next? Watch carefully and you will see that thoughts simply appear, and the ego is the one who claims ownership of them, who says my thought as if you authored them deliberately. But this is the great illusion. You are not the thinker of thoughts, you are the space in which thoughts appear. Just as the sky does not create the clouds but provides the space for them to form and dissolve, your true nature is the awareness in which thoughts and emotions and sensations appear and disappear. The ego is simply one particular thought pattern that has gained so much momentum and repetition that it feels solid and permanent, when in reality it is as empty and transient as every other thought. Watch how the ego builds itself through constant self-referential thinking. It says I am proud, or I am ashamed, or I am better than, or I am worse than. Every time you say I am followed by some quality or comparison, you are feeding the illusion, strengthening the false self. But who is this I that you keep referring to? If you look deeply, you will find that there is no solid, separate self there at all, only a flowing river of experiences, thoughts, sensations, all appearing in the vast space of awareness that you truly are. The bamboo knows this secret. It is hollow inside, empty of a solid self, and this very emptiness is what gives it strength to bend without breaking when the storm comes. Your true nature is like this, empty of ego, and in that emptiness lies a flexibility and freedom that the rigid ego can never know. Now I want to guide you into the practical understanding of how to see through the ego illusion in your daily life, how to recognize the difference between the voice of ego and the silence of your true nature. Throughout your day, begin to notice the quality of your thoughts. When a thought arises that defends you, that compares you to others, that rehearses past conversations or imagines future scenarios where you prove yourself right, recognize this as the voice of ego. It has a certain flavor to it, a contracted quality, like a fist clenching. The ego's thoughts are always about maintaining and protecting the false self, about being seen in a certain way, about avoiding shame and cultivating pride. But there is another quality of knowing that does not come from thought at all. When you watch a sunset and for a moment all thought stops and there is only the experience of beauty, this is not ego. When you help someone in need without thinking about whether it makes you a good person, this is not ego. When you create something from a place of pure inspiration without concern for recognition, this is not ego. These moments reveal your true nature, what the Taoists call the original face, the Tao mind that operates without the filter of self-concern. The practice we call Zhuo Wang, sitting and forgetting, is designed specifically to let the ego mind settle so the Tao mind can emerge. You sit quietly and watch thoughts arise and dissolve without claiming them as yours, without following their storylines, without believing their urgency. At first, this feels impossible because the ego has had free rein for so long. It will scream for attention, creating dramatic thoughts to lure you back into identification. This is boring, it will say, or you're wasting time, or you should be doing something productive. But each time you simply notice these thoughts without believing them, without acting on them, you weaken the ego's grip. Ask yourself this powerful question when you notice suffering arising. Who is suffering? Look for this one who claims to be suffering, and you will find only thoughts about suffering, feelings in the body, stories about what the suffering means, but no actual separate self who owns the suffering. The suffering is happening, but there is no sufferer, only the vast awareness in which suffering appears and eventually dissolves like everything else. As you continue practicing this observation of ego versus awareness, you will begin noticing profound shifts in how you experience life, changes that happen not because you work to improve the ego, but because you saw through its fundamental unreality. The first sign of awakening from the ego dream is a feeling of spaciousness and lightness, as if a heavy backpack you have been carrying your entire life has suddenly been removed. This is the burden of self-consciousness, the exhausting effort of maintaining an image, defending a position, making sure everyone thinks well of you. When you realize these concerns belong to an illusion, they lose their power to create suffering. You can still engage with the practical world, still have preferences and make decisions, but without the heavy overlay of egoic self-importance. This is what the Taoists mean by Wu Wei, action without the doer, accomplishment without attachment to being the one who accomplished. The second sign is a dramatic reduction in internal conflict. The ego creates suffering through constant comparison and judgment, constantly measuring yourself against others, against your own past, against your imagined ideal future. But when you recognize yourself as the awareness in which all these comparisons appear, the whole game becomes transparent and loses its grip. You see that the one who feels inferior and the one who feels superior are both constructs of the same ego, two sides of the same illusion. Your true nature is neither inferior nor superior. It simply is, like the sky that contains both storm clouds and sunshine, without being defined by either. The third sign is the arising of what we call spontaneous virtue, which means acting appropriately without needing to think about whether you are being a good person. The ego is always concerned with morality because it wants to maintain the image of being good, but your true nature simply responds to each situation with what is needed. Without calculation or self-congratulation, you help because helping is what the moment calls for, not because you are trying to be a helpful person. This is the difference between the ego's manufactured virtue and the natural harmony of the Tao, expressing through you when the false self is not blocking the way. The transformation continues deepening as you make this practice of observing the ego a constant inquiry rather than a one-time insight. You begin to understand at a cellular level what Lao Tzu meant when he said that the Tao is eternally nameless, that the moment you try to define it or grasp it, you lose it. Your true nature is like this. It cannot be captured by thought, because it is that which is aware of thought. The ego desperately wants to understand itself, to figure out who it really is. But this very searching is the ego trying to maintain itself by making itself into an object it can know. But you are not an object, you are the subject, the awareness itself, and awareness cannot be objectified any more than a knife can cut itself, or an eye can see itself directly. This is why the ancient teaching says you must lose yourself to find yourself. You must die to the false self to be born into the truth. This sounds dramatic, but it simply means you must let go of the belief that the collection of thoughts and stories you call me is who you truly are. In meditation, there comes moments when all thought stops, when even the sense of being a separate observer dissolves, and there is just pure experiencing without an experiencer. The Taoists call this returning to the source, and in these moments you taste your true nature directly, not as a concept but as living reality. The clarity and peace of these moments stays with you even when thought and ego return, because you have seen behind the curtain, you know the secret now. The ego is like a character in a play who has convinced itself the play is real, and you are the awareness in which the whole play appears. Once you know this, you can still play your role, still engage fully with life, but without the suffering that comes from believing the role is who you really are. The ancient masters lived this way, moving through the world with effortless action, responding appropriately to each situation without the heavy overlay of self-concern that makes everything difficult and painful. As we come to the end of our time together, I want to leave you with a final understanding that can serve as a compass on this pathless path. The ego is not your enemy that needs to be destroyed or transcended. This is a common misunderstanding that creates a new form of suffering, because who would be trying to destroy the ego except the ego itself, creating an impossible war? The truth is simpler and more compassionate. The ego is like a wave that has forgotten it is ocean. It looks at other waves and feels separate. It fears its own dissolution. It tries to make itself bigger and more permanent. But the wave is not separate from ocean. It is ocean temporarily expressing in this form called wave. When the wave remembers its true nature, it does not disappear, it continues waving, but without the fear and struggle that came from believing itself separate. You are like this wave, and the ego is simply your forgetting. Your true nature, the Tao expressing as your particular form, does not need to defeat the ego, it only needs to remember what it has always been. The thoughts will continue, the personality will continue, the ability to function in the world will continue, but the identification with thoughts as self will loosen. And in that loosening comes a freedom that cannot be lost because it was never dependent on circumstances in the first place. Today I invite you to practice the simplest and most profound meditation. Notice who is noticing. When you are aware of a thought, ask yourself who is aware of this thought. When you are aware of an emotion, notice the awareness itself. When you catch yourself lost in the ego's stories, simply recognize that something in you is able to notice being lost, and that something is your true nature, untouched by whatever appears within it. This practice costs nothing, requires no special posture or technique, and can be done in any moment of your day. Return here and share your experience by leaving that phrase, "I am not my thoughts, I am the awareness behind them." If this ancient wisdom resonates with something deep in your being that recognizes truth when it hears it, I invite you to continue walking this path with me by joining this channel. Together we will explore the way of water and mountains and the freedom that comes from seeing through the greatest illusion, the illusion of separation that the ego maintains. Remember this always: the river does not believe itself separate from water, the wave does not believe itself separate from ocean, and you are not separate from the Tao, from the source, from the awareness that gives birth to all experience. The ego is simply the forgetting of this truth, and awakening is simply the remembering. You cannot practice your way into what you already are. You can only stop believing the thoughts that tell you you are something other than what you have always been. The sage does not defeat the ego. The sage simply sees through it the way you see through a dream when you wake in the morning. The wise person does not fight their thoughts. The wise person recognizes themselves as the space in which thoughts appear and disappear like birds flying through empty sky. Be like the sky today, vast and untouched by whatever passes through it, and discover that what you have been seeking is what has been seeking through you all along, the Tao recognizing itself in this form you call yourself. Go now in peace, carrying this remembering like a lantern in the darkness of forgetting, and know that every moment of noticing you are not your thoughts is a moment of returning home to your true nature, which is simply the Tao, eternally present, eternally free, eternally whole, pretending for a moment to be you, and now ready to remember what it never stopped being.